A siren wailed somewhere outside the glass doors, the sound thin at first, then suddenly so close it seemed to vibrate the metal handrail beneath Elias Mercer's fingers. Inside the lobby of Briarline Regional Medical Center, the air smelled like lemon disinfectant and burnt coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A television mounted near the waiting area was muted, captions crawling along the bottom like a second heartbeat. Elias stood beside the mop bucket he'd been pushing only minutes ago, his gray maintenance uniform still damp at the knees. The name patch on his chest read Mercer in frayed blue stitching. In one hand he held a folded yellow caution sign. In the other, a pair of latex gloves he hadn't had time to put on. Across from him, an ER nurse, young, hair pulled back tight, stared at him like he'd stepped out of a supply closet at the worst possible moment. "Sir," she said, voice sharp with the kind of authority that comes from being tired and right, "you can't be here." Elias didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't do anything that would fit the role everyone had already assigned him in their minds. He just listened. Because beyond the automatic doors, the paramedic team was rolling someone in fast, too fast for a normal intake. A gurney clattered. A radio crackled. Someone yelled, "Clear the hall." And for a single breath, Elias caught a glimpse of the patient. A man in a military uniform, chest rising in shallow, uneven pulls, his face pale under the harsh lobby lights. A high-end tight haircut, a patch on the shoulder, boots still on. The soldier's right hand was clenched like he was trying not to let go of something invisible. "Move," a security guard barked, stepping toward Elias. "Maintenance out of the way." Elias stepped back instinctively, but his eyes stayed on the soldier. Not with curiosity, not with the morbid fascination people get when an ambulance arrives. With recognition. Not of the man's face. Of the pattern. The way the soldier's breathing stuttered. The way his jaw was locked. The way one side of his neck looked just slightly fuller than the other, subtle enough that most people would miss it, especially in chaos. Elias' mouth went dry. He'd seen this before. He took one step forward without thinking. The security guard reached for his shoulder. And at that exact moment, the soldier's eyes flickered open, unfocused, searching, and landed on Elias like a hand finding a rail in darkness. The soldier tried to speak. No sound came out. Then his body jolted in a sudden, panicked spasm against the gurney straps. One of the paramedics muttered, "He's decompensating." Elias heard the words, but his mind was already past them. He saw the next 30 seconds unfolding like a memory, not a prediction. He saw what they were about to miss. And he knew, deep in the quiet place he kept sealed behind years of silence, that if nobody intervened right now, the soldier would not make it to a trauma bay. Not because the hospital wasn't good. Not because the paramedics weren't skilled. But because a tiny decision made in the wrong direction, one line of action that seemed reasonable, could close the only door left open. Elias looked at the nurse, then the paramedics, then the security guard. He swallowed once. "His airway's going to collapse," Elias said calmly, as if he were commenting on a wet floor. "If you lay him flat, you'll lose him." The nurse blinked, the security guard scoffed. One of the paramedics turned his head, irritation flashing. "Who are you?" Elias didn't answer the way a janitor should. He answered the way someone trained for this would. "Sit him up now, keep his head midline, don't force an airway adjunct. Call trauma and ENT. Tell them it's a neck space compromise, possibly a rapidly expanding hematoma." The lobby went still, in a way Elias could feel more than hear. The security guard's grip tightened on his shoulder. "You need to shut up and—" But the soldier's chest suddenly stopped moving for a beat. His lips parted. A thin, high sound escaped, like air struggling through a narrowing straw. One paramedic's eyes widened. Then, faster than etiquette, faster than hierarchy, faster than pride, the paramedic did the one thing that mattered. He listened. "Sit him up," the paramedic snapped to his partner. The gurney angle shifted. The soldier coughed once, wet, shallow, and pulled in a breath that sounded slightly less like failure. The nurse's face changed. Not to trust. Not yet. But to alarm. Because for the first time, she could see it too. Something was wrong in a way that didn't fit the script. And Elias Mercer, the man in a maintenance uniform with a mop bucket behind him, had just spoken like he belonged on the other side of the double doors. Pause. Elias hadn't always been the guy people waved past without looking. But Briarline Regional had a way of shrinking people, folding them into roles like uniforms, nurse, doctor, security, patient, visitor, janitor. And Elias had let it happen. Not because he was weak. Because it was simpler. He worked the early shift, starting before dawn, when the corridors were quiet and the hospital still smelled faintly of night. He scrubbed scuff marks off tile. He replaced ceiling panels. He unclogged drains nobody wanted to touch. He took out trash that could have told 10,000 private stories if it had a voice. He did it with a steadiness that made him invisible. The nurses called him maintenance most days, not Elias. Some were kind, some curt, most distracted. Doctors rarely made eye contact unless something was broken in a way that inconvenienced them. And then there was Ms. Lorna Kessler, Director of Operations. She ran Briarline like the building was a machine, and the staff were gears that could be replaced if they squeaked too loudly. She wore crisp suits, always neutral colors, always pressed like she slept standing up. Her smile never reached her eyes. To her, Elias was a line item. A cost. A man who should be grateful for a paycheck and silent about everything else. "You're here to keep this place clean," she'd told him once, in that tone that sounded like it belonged in a corporate training video. Not to get involved. It had been after Elias had stopped to help a patient in the hallway, a woman dizzy, clutching the wall, guiding her gently to a chair and calling for a nurse. Ms. Kessler had watched it like it was theft. "Don't create liability," she'd said. "If someone falls while you're touching them, that's on us." Elias had nodded once and gone back to his cart. What Ms. Kessler didn't know, what almost nobody at Briarline knew, was that Elias didn't touch people casually. He touched them like he was counting consequences. Because long before he'd ever pushed a mop in a hospital corridor, he'd been trained to keep people alive in places where help didn't come with sirens. Briarline's culture had its own unwritten rules, and Elias had learned them quickly. Don't speak in meetings you're not invited to. Don't linger near clinical areas. Don't make suggestions unless you want them thrown back at you. And above all, don't embarrass the wrong person. Elias had tried to live quietly inside those rules. He came in, did his work, and went home to his small rented duplex on the edge of town, where the porch light flickered and the neighbors kept to themselves. He didn't have pictures on his walls, except one framed photograph tucked inside a kitchen cabinet where no guests would see it. A younger Elias in a different uniform, standing beside a helicopter with his arm around a man whose face was blurred from sun and wind. He kept that life sealed up. Not out of shame. Out of exhaustion. Because when people found out what you'd done before, they didn't just get curious. They got demanding. They asked for stories. They asked for favors. They asked why you weren't still doing it. And Elias didn't have an answer that felt clean. So he let Briarline think he was just a janitor. But even invisibility has friction. It shows up in little things. Like how Dr. Graham Lyle, one of the younger attending physicians, ambitious, polished, always in motion, would step around Elias' wet floor sign like it was a personal insult, then complain if his shoes squeaked. Or how an ER-charge nurse named Tessa Morgan, sharp-eyed and competent but perpetually stressed, would snap, "Not now," whenever Elias asked if she needed a spill cleaned in a patient bay. And how Ms. Kessler kept a folder on everyone. Not a literal folder, Elias suspected. These days it was likely digital. But he could feel it, the way she watched, the way she stored moments. Like the day Elias quietly reported a malfunctioning automatic door that had nearly closed on an elderly man's walker. Ms. Kessler had smiled and said, "Thank you," like a compliment. Then later she'd told his supervisor he was overstepping and distracting clinical flow. It was a small humiliation. One of many. But Elias had learned something in other places. Small humiliations stack like sandbags. Eventually you can't see the wall behind them, and when pressure hits, the wall fails. There were breadcrumbs, little things people noticed without understanding. Like the way Elias carried himself, Not stiff but balanced, like he always knew where exits were. Like the way he listened when people spoke, not to respond, to assess. Like the way he never startled when alarms went off. And the biggest breadcrumb of all, Elias had a habit of stopping just for half a second whenever he passed the trauma bay doors. He'd glance at the red sign that said authorized personnel only. And his eyes would go distant, like he could hear another set of doors, another hallway, another voice calling for a medic. No one asked him about it. No one cared enough. Until the day the soldier came through the lobby, choking on tea. Me. CTA. Before we push deeper into what happened inside that hospital. Before we find out why a maintenance worker knew exactly what to do when everyone else hesitated. Take a second and tap subscribe if you want more fictional stories where quiet competence meets public justice, and where the person everyone overlooks ends up changing everything. Pause. The soldier's name, Elias learned later, was Staff Sergeant Nolan Rusk. But in the first minutes, he was just incoming. Just male, mid-30s, military, unstable. The paramedic team rolled him toward the ER doors, and Elias found himself walking with them. Not pushing, not touching, just keeping pace like gravity had chosen him. Security tried to block him again. You can't. I'm not going in, Elias said. His voice stayed even. Just tell them to keep him upright. The paramedic glanced back at him, eyes narrowed with suspicion and something else, reluctant gratitude. Then the gurney disappeared behind the double doors, swallowed by clinical light and urgency. Elias stood in the lobby for a moment, breathing like someone who'd just run, though he hadn't. The nurse who'd first confronted him, a woman named Janelle, hovered near the desk with her mouth slightly open. "Who are you?" she asked again, quieter this time. Elias looked at his hands. They were trembling just barely. "Just maintenance," he said. It was the safest answer. But even as he said it, he knew the moment had already cracked something open. Because once people see competence where they don't expect it, they don't forget. And in a place like Briarline, where status mattered, where roles were rigid, unexpected competence was dangerous. Not to the patient, to the hierarchy. Within 15 minutes, Elias was back in the corridor near radiology, trying to return to his routine like it was a coat he could put on again. But the hospital had already started to whisper. He caught fragments. "Did you hear about the janitor in the lobby? Maintenance guy said something about airway collapse. Paramedics changed position because of him." "Who was that?" Elias kept his head down, rolling his cart past the vending machines, past the break room, past the bulletin board where someone had taped a flyer for Employee Appreciation Week, next to a list of overdue compliance trainings. He told himself it would fade. It always did. But at 9:07 a.m., he was called to the administrative hallway. Not by his supervisor, by Ms. Lorna Kessler herself. Her assistant met him at the door with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ms. Kessler would like a word. Elias' stomach sank in that familiar way, like stepping onto a stair you thought was there but wasn't. Ms. Kessler's office was spotless, the kind of clean that wasn't achieved by mops but by power. A framed diploma hung on the wall. A small plant sat in the corner, so perfectly watered it looked artificial. Ms. Kessler didn't invite him to sit. She stood behind her desk, hands folded, and looked at Elias like he was a stain someone had tracked in. "I'm told you interfered with a medical intake this morning," she said. Elias didn't argue. "I spoke from the lobby." "You gave clinical instructions." "I shared an observation." Ms. Kessler's lips tightened. "You are not credentialed to do that here." Elias met her eyes for the first time. Someone's life was at risk. "And you don't know that?" she snapped, the calm veneer cracking just enough to show the steel beneath. "You don't know his condition. You don't know what the paramedics were trained to do. You don't know our protocols." Elias said nothing. Because he did know. He knew exactly. Ms. Kessler leaned forward slightly. "If that patient dies and someone traces it back to an unlicensed maintenance employee giving direction, this hospital is exposed. Do you understand what you've done?" Elias swallowed. "I understand what could have happened if nobody adjusted him." Ms. Kessler's eyes flashed. You're not paid to understand. You're paid to clean floors. There it was. The line, the boundary she needed him to stay behind. Elias felt the urge to say more, to explain, to justify, to lift the curtain and show her the truth. But he'd learned that truth didn't always protect you. Sometimes it just gave people more angles to attack. So he nodded once. Ms. Kessler exhaled like she'd won. I'm placing a formal note in your file for inappropriate involvement in clinical operations. A pause. And she added, voice turning colder, you are not to loiter near the ER entrance. If you have duties near there, you do them quickly and you leave. Am I clear? Elias looked at the polished surface of her desk. He could see his own reflection, warped in the shine maintenance uniform, tired eyes, quiet face. Yes, he said. Good, Ms. Kessler replied. Now go do your job. Elias turned to leave. And behind him, Ms. Kessler's voice followed like a final warning. Mr. Mercer, the next time you feel the urge to play hero, don't. Pause. By mid-morning, the ER was buzzing in that subdued way it gets when something serious is happening behind closed doors. People spoke softly, walked faster, avoided eye contact in clusters. Elias tried to stay away. He replaced a light fixture in the outpatient hallway. He restocked paper towels in the staff bathrooms. He fixed a squeaky door hinge that had been on the maintenance request list for months. But his mind kept drifting back to the soldier's face. To that moment of eye contact. To the hand clenched like a promise. Around noon, Elias was pushing his cart past the staff cafeteria when he heard Dr. Graham Lyle's voice. And then some janitor starts barking orders like he's an attending. Laughter sharp and dismissive. Elias slowed without meaning to. The cafeteria line was long, staff in scrubs and lab coats, chatter echoing off the tiled walls. Dr. Lyle stood near the condiment station with two residents, his white coat pristine, his hair styled like he had time to care about it. One resident, a young woman with tired eyes, frowned faintly. But the paramedics said it helped, they said. Dr. Lyle waved his hand. They say a lot. People love a folk hero story. Some blue-collar saint swoops in and saves the day. It's nonsense. Elias felt heat rise behind his ears. Not because of the insult. Because Dr. Lyle didn't know how close nonsense had been to death. Another staff member, an older nurse, chimed in. Operations is furious. Kessler's already drafting a memo. Dr. Lyle smirked. Good, maybe it'll remind people to stay in their lane. Elias pushed his cart forward, wheels squeaking. Dr. Lyle noticed him then, and his expression brightened like he'd been handed an opportunity. Well, speak of the mop, he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Hey, maintenance, you saving any more lives today? A few chuckles. Elias stopped, slowly. He looked at Dr. Lyle, then at the residents, then at the nurse who looked vaguely uncomfortable. He could have snapped back. He could have said, I've saved more lives than you've ever met. But he didn't. He just said, excuse me, and moved past. The laughter followed him for a moment, then faded behind the clatter of trays. But the humiliation didn't fade. It stayed in his chest like a stone. Because it wasn't just about him. It was about what people needed to believe. That competence belonged only to certain uniforms. That authority lived in certain titles. And if someone outside that system proved otherwise, the system would punish them until the universe made sense again. Elias finished his shift and went home early evening, the sky already leaning toward winter gray. His duplex was small, clean, and quiet. He ate reheated soup at the kitchen table. He washed his bowl. He stared at the cabinet where the framed photograph was hidden. He didn't open it. Instead, he sat on the couch and listened to the silence. At 10:14 p.m., his phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. Elias hesitated before answering. Mercer, he said. A pause on the line. Then a voice, low and controlled. Is this Elias Mercer? Yes. This is Captain Dana Harrow. Elias sat up straighter, muscles tightening before his mind caught up. The voice continued. United States Army, I'm calling from Fort Ashland's liaison office. We have a situation involving one of our NCOs at Briarline Regional. Elias felt his throat tighten. Captain Harrow said, "They told me a janitor intervened during intake. They also told me that janitor might have prevented a fatal airway compromise." Elias closed his eyes briefly. Captain Harrow's voice softened just a fraction. "I need to ask you directly. Were you in the lobby when Staff Sergeant Nolan Rusk arrived?" "Yes," Elias said. "And did you give direction?" Elias exhaled slowly. "I said what I saw. They chose what to do." Another pause. "Then, Mr. Mercer, do you have medical training?" Elias didn't answer immediately. Because the lie would be easy. And the truth would change everything. He pictured Ms. Kessler's office, Dr. Lyle's laughter, the memo being drafted, the folder with his name on it. Captain Harrow waited, patient and steady. Elias finally said quietly, "Yes." "What kind?" Elias' eyes opened. He looked at the blank wall in front of him. "Combat medicine," he said, "a long time ago." Captain Harrow's voice didn't shift to skepticism. It shifted to respect. "Understood," she said. "I'll be at Briarline tomorrow morning in person." Elias' stomach dropped. "Why?" he asked. Captain Harrow's answer came like a door unlocking. "Because Staff Sergeant Rusk is conscious now," she said, "and he's asking for you." Pause. CTA. If you're the kind of listener who likes to catch the small clues before the big reveal, like why a quiet maintenance worker would get a call from an army captain, go ahead and hit like R. Right now, it tells me you want more stories where the truth is hidden in plain sight, and the payoff is earned. Pause. The next morning, Briarline woke up with the peculiar tension of a building that sensed trouble approaching. Elias arrived before dawn as usual. He clocked in. He grabbed his cart. He kept his head down. But whispers followed him like a draft. Somebody in HR glanced up too quickly when he walked by. A security guard who usually ignored him watched him a little longer. Tessa Morgan, the ER charge nurse, passed him in the hallway and paused. "You're Mercer," she said. Elias nodded. Her eyes searched his face. "What you said yesterday, it matched what ENT confirmed. The swelling was moving fast. If we'd laid him back, we would have had a nightmare on our hands." Elias kept his voice neutral. "I'm glad he's okay." Tessa hesitated. "Kessler's not glad." Elias almost smiled, but didn't. Tessa lowered her voice. "Be careful." Then she walked away, shoulders tight. At 8:32 a.m., Ms. Kessler's assistant intercepted Elias near the maintenance closet. "Ms. Kessler needs you in conference room B," she said. "Not the office this time." A conference room meant witnesses. Elias felt his heart slow, not speed up. That was the strange thing. Fear didn't always make him frantic. Sometimes it made him calm, like the world narrowed into a single corridor and everything else fell away. Conference room B smelled like dry marker ink and stale air. The blinds were half closed. A long table sat in the center, surrounded by chairs that squeaked when you shifted. Ms. Kessler was there, seated at the head of the table. So was Dr. Graham Lyle. And a man from HR Elias had seen only once before, Mr. Patton, holding a tablet like it was a weapon. Ms. Kessler gestured toward the chair nearest the door. "Sit." Elias sat. Ms. Kessler folded her hands. "Mr. Mercer, we're here to address a serious breach of policy." Dr. Lyle leaned back, arms crossed, faint smile on his face. HR Patton cleared his throat. "We've received reports that you provided clinical instructions to emergency responders on hospital property." Elias said nothing. Ms. Kessler continued. "We've also received reports that you have represented yourself as medically trained." Elias' eyes flicked to Dr. Lyle, who was watching him like he'd already decided the ending. HR Patton said, "Do you deny these reports?" Elias spoke carefully. "I did not represent myself as anything. I said what I observed." Ms. Kessler's jaw tightened. "Answer the second part. Do you have medical training?" Elias knew the trap. If he said yes, they would accuse him of impersonation. If he said no, they would accuse him of reckless interference. He chose the truth anyway. "Yes," Elias said, "I do." Dr. Lyle let out a small laugh. "Of course you do." Ms. Kessler's eyes sharpened. "What kind?" Elias kept his gaze steady. "Emergency medicine training, military." The room went quiet. HR Patton's eyebrows rose. Are you currently licensed? Elias shook his head. No. Ms. Kessler pounced on that. Then you had no authority, no legal standing to give direction. Elias' voice stayed calm. I didn't touch the patient. I didn't enter the ER. I said out loud that his airway was at risk. The paramedics made their choice. Dr. Lyle leaned forward. You realize you could have killed him, right? Giving amateur guesses like some back alley hero. Elias' eyes narrowed slightly. It wasn't a guess. Dr. Lyle's smile faded. Excuse me. Ms. Kessler snapped. Mr. Mercer, you are not here to debate. You are here to understand consequences. HR Patton tapped his tablet. Given the liability concerns, and given prior notes in your file regarding boundary issues, Operations is recommending immediate suspension pending review. The words landed like a punch disguised as paperwork. Elias breathed in slow. Ms. Kessler watched him with something like satisfaction, as if this was the universe correcting itself. Turn in your badge, she said. You'll be escorted off-site. Elias stared at her for a beat. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his ID badge on its lanyard, and placed it on the table. It made a soft plastic sound when it hit. Dr. Lyle's eyes flicked to the badge, then back to Elias. Should have stayed in your lane, he said quietly. Elias stood. He didn't slam a chair, he didn't protest, he didn't beg. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a weather report. And as he turned toward the door, he heard Ms. Kessler's voice, cold, final. This is what happens when people forget their place. Pause. Elias walked out of conference room B with a security guard behind him, the hall suddenly too bright, too public. People looked up as he passed, some looked away quickly, others stared. In the lobby, the same space where the soldier had rolled in the day before, Elias paused near the automatic doors. The security guard said, "Keep moving." Elias turned his head just enough to see the ER entrance down the corridor. The double doors. Authorized personnel only. He wondered briefly if Staff Sergeant Rusk knew what was happening. If the man whose life had been steadied by a small correction now lay in a bed, while the person who'd spoken up was being pushed out like trash. Elias stepped outside into cold morning air. The doors slid shut behind him with a soft hiss. And for a moment, he stood on the sidewalk in his maintenance uniform, hands empty, as if he'd been erased. Then a black SUV pulled into the loading zone. It wasn't hospital security, not a patient vehicle. The windows were tinted, the paint polished. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out in a crisp Army service uniform, cap tucked under her arm. She moved with controlled purpose, scanning the building like she was assessing a perimeter. Captain Dana Harrow. She spotted Elias immediately. Not because he stood out. Because she was looking for him. She walked straight up, boots clicking on concrete. Mr. Mercer, she asked. Elias nodded, Captain. Her eyes flicked over his uniform, then to the empty lanyard spot on his chest. They suspended you, she said, not a question. Yes. Captain Harrow's jaw tightened, for saving my soldier's life. Elias didn't answer. Captain Harrow turned toward the hospital doors. Come with me. Elias hesitated. They don't want me inside. Captain Harrow's gaze snapped back to him. Then they're about to have a very uncomfortable morning. She walked toward the entrance. The automatic doors opened like nothing had changed. But everything had. Elias followed. Inside, the lobby staff stiffened as the Army captain strode in. Conversations stopped. A volunteer at the information desk sat up straighter. Captain Harrow approached the front desk. I need to speak with the hospital administrator on duty, now. The receptionist blinked. Ms. Kessler. Good, Captain Harrow said. Tell her Captain Dana Harrow is here regarding Staff Sergeant Nolan Rusk, and tell her I'm also here regarding Elias Mercer. The receptionist's fingers fumbled over the phone. Elias stood slightly behind Captain Harrow, feeling the strange sensation of being seen, truly seen, by someone who didn't care what uniform he wore now. Within minutes, Ms. Kessler appeared from the administrative hallway like a storm in human form. Her eyes landed on Elias first, and the tight composure in her face cracked. Mr. Mercer, she snapped, you are not allowed. Captain Harrow stepped forward, cutting her off with a calm that was sharper than shouting. Ms. Kessler, she said, I'm Captain Harrow, U.S. Army. One of my soldiers is in your hospital, recovering from a life-threatening airway compromise. Ms. Kessler's expression shifted into polished diplomacy. Captain, of course, we're providing excellent care, if you'd like. I'd like to know, Captain Harrow said, voice steady, why the man who prevented a fatal intake complication is being escorted off-site like a criminal. Ms. Kessler's smile froze. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Mercer is a maintenance employee who overstepped. He did not overstep, Captain Harrow said. He did what trained personnel sometimes fail to do in chaos. He recognized a pattern. Ms. Kessler's eyes hardened. He is not licensed. Captain Harrow nodded slowly. No, he's not licensed to practice medicine in your facility, but he is trained, and he is the reason Staff Sergeant Rusk is alive to be treated by your licensed staff. A small crowd had begun to gather. Nurses, visitors, a few staff in scrubs pausing mid-walk. Ms. Kessler noticed, and her voice lowered. Captain, perhaps we can discuss this privately. Captain Harrow glanced around, then back at Ms. Kessler. No, she said. We'll discuss it where the people who witnessed his humiliation can also witness his vindication. Elias felt his chest tighten at that word. Vindication. Captain Harrow turned slightly toward Elias. Mr. Mercer, do you consent to me disclosing certain details of your background in order to correct what's happening here? Elias swallowed. This was the moment he'd avoided for years. The moment when the hidden life became public. He looked at Ms. Kessler, at Dr. Lyle, who had appeared behind her now, watching with narrowed eyes, at the receptionist, frozen mid-breath, at the nurses, curious and tense. And then Elias heard something else. A wheeled IV pole clinking in the corridor, a hospital bed rolling. A patient transport team moving carefully. And on that bed, upright, pale but awake, was Staff Sergeant Nolan Rusk. He was being moved slowly toward imaging, escorted by a nurse. His eyes were alert, scanning. They found Elias. Rusk's gaze locked on him with an intensity that made the lobby feel smaller. The soldier lifted his hand, slowly, with effort. And he gave Elias a salute. Not a casual jest. You're a real one. A disciplined one. The kind that carries weight. The lobby went silent in a way Elias could feel in his bones. Rusk's voice came out hoarse but clear. That's him, he said. That's the man who saved my life. And that's when the room changed. Pause. CTA. Right here, right at the moment the soldier points him out in public. Drop a comment with what you think Elias really was before he became just maintenance. And if you want the rest of this fictional story where the truth finally hits the people who mocked him, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Pause. Ms. Kessler's face went rigid, like someone had pulled the power cord on her expression. Dr. Lyle's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Captain Harrow stepped forward, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the gathering crowd. Staff Sergeant Rusk, she said, are you stable enough to speak? Rusk swallowed, pain flashing across his face, but he nodded. Yes, ma'am. Captain Harrow turned to the nurse escorting him. I'll keep this brief. The nurse looked uncertain, then nodded, eyes flicking between Captain Harrow and Ms. Kessler as if trying to decide who outranked whom in this space. Captain Harrow faced Ms. Kessler. Your staff disciplined Mr. Mercer for intervening. I'd like to hear in your own words what your accusation is. Ms. Kessler recovered enough to lift her chin. We have protocols. We cannot allow uncredentialed personnel to give medical instructions. It creates liability. Captain Harrow nodded. Understood. Now I'd like to hear what actually happened from your staff. She looked at the paramedic who had returned to the lobby area. He'd been nearby, drawn by the commotion. His uniform still had the faint smell of road and antiseptic. You, Captain Harrow said, were you on the intake? The paramedic hesitated, then stepped forward. Yes, ma'am. What did Mr. Mercer say? The paramedic cleared his throat. He said the patient's airway was going to collapse if we laid him flat, told us to sit him up, keep his head midline, call trauma and ENT. And did you follow that? Yes. Why? The paramedic looked uncomfortable. Because the patient was making Strider, and when he said it, it clicked. We adjusted. The patient improved. Captain Harrow turned to Tessa Morgan, who had appeared near the ER corridor, arms crossed, watching. "Your charge nurse," Captain Harrow said. Tessa's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. "Yes." "Was the patient's airway compromised?" Tessa exhaled. "Yes, he had expanding swelling. ENT confirmed it. If we'd had to intubate emergently in the lobby, it would have been bad." Captain Harrow nodded slowly, letting the words hang. Then she looked back at Ms. Kessler. "Your liability," Captain Harrow said, "is not that Mr. Mercer spoke up." Ms. Kessler's eyes narrowed. "Your liability," Captain Harrow continued, voice steady, "is that you punished him for doing it. You created a culture where people fear policy more than they fear the patient dying in front of them." Dr. Lyle scoffed softly, unable to help himself. "Captain, with respect, you don't understand hospital operations. We can't have random staff giving orders." Captain Harrow's gaze snapped to him. "And you are?" Dr. Lyle hesitated a fraction. "Dr. Graham Lyle attending." Captain Harrow nodded. "Dr. Lyle, did you evaluate Staff Sergeant Rusk on intake?" Dr. Lyle's jaw tightened. "No, I was not the attending on that case." "So you weren't there," Captain Harrow said, "but you were comfortable mocking the man who was." Dr. Lyle's cheeks flushed. "I didn't." Rusk's voice cut in, hoarse but strong with conviction. "You laughed at him," Rusk said. "I heard you in the hallway last night, when they rolled me past the cafeteria. You said janitor playing hero." Dr. Lyle went still. "Because that wasn't rumor. That was witness." Ms. Kessler's eyes darted to Dr. Lyle, calculating. Captain Harrow's voice softened slightly when she spoke again, but it didn't lose its edge. "Staff Sergeant Rusk," she said, "would you be willing to tell them what you remember?" Rusk swallowed again, eyes shining with controlled emotion. "I remember not being able to breathe," he said. "I remember thinking I was going to black out before I even got through the doors, and I remember hearing a calm voice, not panicked, not loud, just certain." He looked at Elias. "That voice made them sit me up," Rusk said. "That voice gave me time." Elias felt his throat tighten. He didn't look away. Rusk continued. "Then I remember them telling me later the guy who spoke up got written up." His hand curled slightly against the blanket. "So yeah, I asked for him." Captain Harrow turned back to Ms. Kessler. "Now," she said, "we can do this the easy way or the official way." Ms. Kessler's lips pressed together. "I'm happy to discuss." Captain Harrow lifted a hand. "Official way, your hospital reset. Ives federal funding. You are currently treating active duty personnel. My command expects cooperative partnership." "A beat." And Captain Harrow added, "I have already contacted your hospital's compliance office and patient advocacy line. They are on their way, along with someone else." Ms. Kessler's eyes flickered. "Someone else." Captain Harrow's gaze held hers. "A medical inspector." The word landed like a weight. The lobby murmured. Ms. Kessler's posture stiffened. "Captain, this is unnecessary." Captain Harrow's voice lowered. "Then reinstate him, publicly apologize, correct the record." Ms. Kessler's eyes shifted to Elias, and for a moment Elias saw something raw there, not remorse but fear. Fear of losing control. She took a breath. "We can't." The automatic doors opened again, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside, carrying a slim briefcase and an ID badge clipped to his lapel. Behind him was a woman in a white coat with a clipboard. They walked with the calm assurance of people who were used to being obeyed. The suited man scanned the lobby, then approached Captain Harrow with a nod. "Captain," he said. Captain Harrow nodded back. "Mr. Alden." The suited man turned his gaze to Ms. Kessler. "Ms. Kessler, I'm Raymond Alden, Regional Compliance Auditor. I received a report of potential retaliation against an employee involved in a critical incident response." Ms. Kessler's face drained slightly. The woman in the white coat stepped forward. "Dr. Sato, State Medical Board Liaison, I'm here to document the incident and the hospital's response." And that's when the building's hierarchy began to collapse in on itself. Because Ms. Kessler could intimidate maintenance. She could pressure nurses. She could posture with doctors, but she could not posture with auditors. Not with the army watching. Not with a soldier's testimony echoing in a public lobby. Elias stood silent, the center of a storm he hadn't asked for. And he knew, deep down, that the next thing that happened would decide whether Briarline stayed a place that punished humility or became a place that respected service. Pause. Elias didn't want revenge. He wanted something simpler. He wanted the truth to matter. But the truth doesn't move on its own. It needs an engine. And today, that engine had arrived in a service uniform, a suit, and a white coat. Captain Harrow turned to Elias again, voice quieter now. "Mr. Mercer, it's time." Elias swallowed. His hands were steady now. He nodded once, "Okay." Captain Harrow faced the crowd. "For clarity," she said, "the U.S. Army did not contact Mr. Mercer by accident. We contacted him because his name is in our records." Ms. Kessler's eyes narrowed. "What records?" Captain Harrow's voice was steady, each word placed carefully. Elias Mercer served as a combat medic with the 12th Medevac Detachment. He was attached to forward operations in multiple deployments. He has commendations for medical actions under extreme conditions. The lobby went completely still. The receptionist's mouth fell open slightly. Tessa Morgan's arms loosened at her sides, her expression shifting from guarded to stunned. Dr. Lyle blinked, as if his brain refused the information. Captain Harrow continued, "He is not licensed to practice medicine in your facility, and he didn't attempt to. He recognized a life-threatening airway pattern and spoke up. That is what trained people do." Elias felt his chest tighten with something that wasn't fear. It was grief, because hearing his past spoken aloud felt like reopening a room he'd kept locked for years. Captain Harrow turned slightly, indicating the soldier on the bed. "Staff Sergeant Rusk is alive because someone in your lobby knew what he was seeing." Rusk's eyes didn't leave Elias. His salute had lowered, but the respect remained like a steady flame. Ms. Kessler recovered enough to lift her chin. "Even if that's true," she said, voice sharp, "it doesn't change policy." Raymond Alden, the compliance auditor, spoke for the first time, calm and clinical. "It does, actually," Alden said, "because policy also includes non-retaliation and incident reporting. If an employee is disciplined for reporting a safety concern that is later validated, that becomes a compliance issue." Ms. Kessler's eyes snapped to him. "He's not an employee in a clinical role." Alden nodded. "Correct, which makes the retaliation more concerning, not less. It suggests a culture problem." Dr. Sato, clipboard in hand, glanced at Tessa. "Was an incident report filed acknowledging the intake airway risk and the intervention?" Tessa hesitated. "Not officially," she admitted. "It was handled verbally." Ms. Kessler's gaze burned into Tessa. Tessa's shoulders stiffened, but she held her ground. "Because operations didn't want it written up," she added, quietly but clearly. A ripple went through the staff nearby. Ms. Kessler's lips parted. "That's..." Tessa met her eyes. "You told me it would create liability." The room held its breath. And that's when the story tipped from personal to systemic. Because now it wasn't just about Elias being mocked. It was about the hospital choosing appearances over accountability. Alden made a note on his pad. Captain Harrow's voice lowered. "Ms. Kessler," she said, "you can fix this right now." Ms. Kessler looked around at the crowd, at the auditor, at Dr. Sato, at the soldier watching her like a judge. She turned her gaze back to Elias, and in it Elias saw a flicker of something like realization. Not empathy. Calculation. She was weighing damage. She forced her expression into something like graciousness. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "we appreciate your concern, however." Captain Harrow interrupted, sharp now. "No, not concern, competence." Ms. Kessler's jaw tightened. Alden stepped forward. "Ms. Kessler, from a compliance standpoint, I recommend immediate suspension of disciplinary action pending investigation. And I recommend you refrain from further statements that could be construed as retaliation." Ms. Kessler's hands clenched slightly at her sides. Dr. Lyle spoke up, desperation creeping in. "This is ridiculous. We're letting military pressure dictate hospital." Captain Harrow's gaze cut him off like a blade. You're letting ego dictate your opinion, Doctor. Dr. Lyle flushed. I'm protecting standards. Rusk's hoarse voice cut in again, controlled but loaded with moral weight. Standards don't mean much if they can't keep a man breathing. Silence. Elias felt something shift inside him, not triumph but release. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone in the truth. Pause. CTA. If that line hit you the way it hit the room, standards don't mean much if they can't keep a man breathing. Comment that exact sentence below. And if you want more fictional stories where professionalism beats prejudice without turning into cheap drama, tap subscribe and stay with me to the end. Pause. From there, things moved fast, not in chaos but in procedure. Alden requested a private room. Ms. Kessler insisted on her office. Alden refused. They settled on conference room A, larger, with a glass wall that still made it feel public. Elias was asked to sit in. Not as an accused employee this time. As a witness. Dr. Sato documented statements. The paramedics gave their account. Tessa spoke with careful honesty, admitting the intake risk and the pressure to keep it informal. Ms. Kessler tried to steer the narrative. She used words like protocol deviation and liability mitigation. She suggested Elias' comment had been well-intentioned but disruptive. Alden listened with the quiet focus of a man who didn't get distracted by polished language. Then he asked a simple question. Ms. Kessler, he said, did you discipline Mr. Mercer because you believed his intervention harmed the patient, or because it embarrassed operations? Ms. Kessler's mouth tightened. Because it created liability, she said. Alden nodded, then provide documentation of harm. Ms. Kessler hesitated. There may not be harm, but... So there is no harm, Alden said, tone neutral. Yet there is discipline that is inconsistent. Dr. Lyle tried again, voice rising slightly. This is a dangerous precedent. Anyone could claim they saw something and start directing care. Dr. Sato glanced up. He didn't direct care, he voiced a concern. That's the difference. Dr. Lyle scoffed. He's a janitor. Elias' eyes lifted to him, calm and steady. I'm maintenance, he corrected quietly. Dr. Lyle's face tightened. Whatever, you're not clinical. Captain Harrow's voice entered the room like a door closing. And yet he did the most clinical thing anyone did in that lobby. He recognized a threat and spoke up. Another pause. Then Alden asked Elias directly, Mr. Mercer, why are you working maintenance here? The question hit Elias harder than any accusation. Because it wasn't about policy. It was about pain. Elias looked at the table's surface, then up at the glass wall where faint reflections of staff lingered outside, pretending not to watch. He spoke quietly. Because I needed quiet, he said, and because I didn't want to be thanked for things I'm still trying to make sense of. Captain Harrow's eyes softened. Even Dr. Sato paused, pen hovering. Alden nodded once, as if that answer told him everything he needed to know about Elias' character. Then Alden turned back to Ms. Kessler. I am issuing an immediate directive, he said. Mr. Mercer's suspension is to be lifted pending investigation. Additionally, I am requesting a review of operations, handling of safety reporting, and staff intimidation claims. Ms. Kessler's face went rigid. You can't. Alden's voice stayed calm. I can and I am. Ms. Kessler's eyes flicked to Dr. Lyle, then back. This is overreach. Captain Harrow leaned in slightly. No, she said. This is consequence. Pause. When Elias walked back into the lobby afterward, it felt different. Not because the building had changed. Because the eyes had. Nurses who had once stepped around him now looked at him like he was a person with a story they hadn't earned the right to know. A volunteer near the desk smiled faintly. Tessa Morgan approached him, her posture less guarded than before. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. I should have filed the incident report regardless of what operations wanted. Elias shook his head. You were doing what you thought you had to do. Tessa swallowed. Still, you didn't deserve that. Elias nodded once. No, he said, I didn't. Those words weren't angry. They were simply true. Dr. Lyle passed by a moment later, eyes forward, jaw tight. He didn't speak. He didn't look at Elias. But Elias could feel his resentment like heat. Ms. Kessler emerged from the administrative hallway later that afternoon, accompanied by HR Patton, both of them visibly shaken but trying to wear professionalism like armor. She approached Elias near the maintenance closet. "Mr. Mercer," she said, voice clipped, "your suspension is being reviewed." Elias met her eyes. "I heard." Ms. Kessler's smile was thin. "In the future, you will still follow policy." Elias' gaze stayed steady. "In the future," he said, "I'll still speak up if someone's dying in front of me." Ms. Kessler's eyes flashed. "That is not your decision to make." Elias took a slow breath. "It was yesterday," he said. And that's when Ms. Kessler realized something she hadn't calculated. Elias wasn't afraid of her anymore. Not because he wanted to fight. Because he'd already lived through worse than office politics. Ms. Kessler turned sharply and walked away. But the damage was done. Her authority had been questioned in daylight. And once that happens, it never fully heals. Pause. CTA. If you're still with me at this point in the story, when the punishment turns into paperwork and the real battle becomes truth versus image, hit subscribe now. These fictional narratives always pay off when the quiet person finally stops absorbing the hits and starts standing in the light. Pause. Later that evening, Elias was asked, formally this time, to visit Staff Sergeant Rusk. Not as a janitor. Not as maintenance. As Elias Mercer. He hesitated outside the hospital room door, hand hovering near the handle. He could hear the soft beep of monitors, the low murmur of voices inside. Captain Harrow stood nearby, arms folded, watching him with a steady expression. "You don't have to," she said quietly. Elias looked at the door. "I know." Captain Harrow nodded, but he asked. Elias exhaled. "Okay." He stepped in. The room was dim, lit mostly by a lamp near the bed. Rusk lay propped up, a bandage along his neck, tubing arranged neatly. Nothing graphic, just the clean evidence of how close things had been. Rusk's eyes brightened when he saw Elias. "There you are," he rasped. Elias approached slowly. "How are you feeling?" Rusk gave a hoarse laugh that turned into a cough. "Like I lost a fight with a truck," he said, then his expression turned serious. "They told me you got in trouble." Elias nodded once. "It's being handled." Rusk's gaze sharpened. "Because you spoke up." "Yes." Rusk stared at him for a long beat. "Why'd you do it?" he asked. "You could have stayed quiet. Nobody would have blamed you if I went downhill. You're not even staff." Elias' jaw tightened slightly. He looked at the monitor, the steady rhythm. "I've been the person who needed someone to speak up," Elias said quietly. "And I've been the person who didn't." Rusk swallowed. "You're military," he said. "I knew it the second you spoke." Elias didn't deny it. Rusk's voice softened. "They thought you were a janitor." Elias' eyes held his. "I am," he said, "here." Rusk shook his head slightly, then winced. "No," he said, "you're not just that, not inside." Elias felt something tighten behind his ribs. Rusk lifted his hand slightly. "Thank you," he said, simple, direct, no drama. Elias nodded once. "You're welcome." Captain Harrow watched from the corner, eyes thoughtful. Rusk's gaze flicked to her, then back to Elias. "They don't know who you really are," he said, voice low. Elias' expression stayed calm. "They're starting to." Rusk's eyes narrowed. "Good," he said. Then he added with a faint smile that carried a soldier's stubborn certainty, "Because you deserve better." Pause. The next day, the confrontation became official. Not in a dramatic courtroom way. In the way real institutions are corrected. Emails, statements, meetings, documented facts. Alden's audit triggered a formal review. Dr. Sato's notes went into a report. Captain Harrow's liaison office filed an official commendation for Elias' intervention. Not a medal, not a parade, but a written recognition that carried the weight of the Army's bureaucracy. And Ms. Kessler, who had always controlled the narrative inside Briarline, discovered that she could not control paper trails that existed outside her walls. A staff-wide meeting was called in the large conference hall off the main corridor, the kind of meeting that made people anxious before it even started. Elias almost didn't go. He didn't want spectacle. but Tessa Morgan found him near the maintenance closet again, eyes steady. "You need to be there," she said. Elias frowned. "Why?" Tessa's voice was quiet. "Because they're going to talk about you like you're not in the room, and I'm tired of watching that happen to people." Elias stared at her for a beat. Then he nodded. He went. The conference hall was packed, nurses in scrubs, techs, residents, administrators. The lights were harsh. The air was warm from bodies. Ms. Kessler stood at the front with H.R. Patton and Dr. Lyle beside her. Alden sat in the first row, expression unreadable. Dr. Sato sat beside him. Captain Harrow stood near the side wall, arms behind her back, watching. Elias slipped into a seat near the back. Ms. Kessler began with the polished tone of someone used to controlling rooms. "We are here today," she said, "to address concerns regarding incident response and employee conduct." Elias felt his jaw tighten slightly. Then Alden stood. "Ms. Kessler," he said, voice calm but firm, "I'll be speaking first." A ripple moved through the room. Ms. Kessler's face tightened, but she nodded stiffly. Alden faced the staff. "An incident occurred during the intake of Staff Sergeant Nolan Rusk," he said. "A non-clinical employee, Mr. Elias Mercer, voiced a safety concern regarding airway compromise. That concern was valid. It contributed to a positive outcome." Murmurs. Alden continued. "Mr. Mercer was subsequently disciplined for speaking up. That discipline is under formal review for potential retaliation. Additionally, concerns have been raised about operations discouraging documentation of safety incidents." The room was dead silent now. Alden's gaze moved to Ms. Kessler. "Effective immediately, Mr. Mercer's suspension is rescinded. His personnel file will be corrected to remove improper notes pending final review." Elias' breath caught. Alden turned to the staff again. "We will also be implementing mandatory training regarding safety reporting and non-retaliation." Then, unexpectedly, Alden looked toward the back of the room. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "would you stand?" Every head turned. Elias felt heat rise in his face, but he stood. For a moment, he could hear nothing but the hum of the lights. Alden said, "On behalf of compliance, I want to state clearly, speaking up to prevent harm is not misconduct. It is integrity." A pause, and Alden added, "I recommend this hospital recognize it as such." Captain Harrow stepped forward slightly, and her voice carried through the hall. "Staff Sergeant Rusk asked me to deliver something," she said. "Permission to read, Mr. Alden." Alden nodded. Captain Harrow opened a folded letter. "This is from Staff Sergeant Rusk," she said, "written this morning." She read, voice steady. "To the staff of Briarline, I am alive because one person in your lobby chose courage over comfort." Elias Mercer did not hesitate. He did not ask if it was his job. He saw a man who couldn't breathe and he spoke. "Whatever your titles, whatever your roles, remember that. I will never forget it." Captain Harrow lowered the letter. Silence hung in the air like a held breath. Then something happened that Ms. Kessler couldn't stop with memos. People began to clap. At first scattered, then louder, then unified. Elias stood there, hands at his sides, feeling the strange ache of being honored for something he hadn't done for praise. And that's when the room changed again. Not into worship, into respect. Pause. CTA. If you've ever been underestimated in your own workplace, if you've ever watched someone treat a uniform like it defines a person, tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Elias' place? And if you want more fiction like this where justice is earned through procedure and character, hit like and subscribe so you're here for the next story. Pause. Ms. Kessler didn't clap. Dr. Lyle didn't clap either. They stood frozen, caught between public optics and private resentment. And that was the beginning of consequences. Because when a culture shifts, it doesn't just lift one person up. It exposes who was pushing them down. In the days that followed, details surfaced. Not dramatic secrets, realistic ones. Emails where Ms. Kessler discouraged incident reporting to protect reputation. Messages where Dr. Lyle belittled staff for raising concerns. A pattern of intimidation disguised as efficiency. Tessa Morgan filed a formal complaint, backed by 2 other nurses. The paramedics filed their statement officially. HR Patton tried to mediate, but the narrative had Ulrika. Dye escaped his control, and the hospital board, quiet, distant, usually invisible, suddenly became very interested. One afternoon, Elias was called to another meeting. This time, the invitation came with a chair offered in advance. He walked into the board conference room and saw unfamiliar faces: board members, legal counsel, senior administrators. Ms. Kessler was there too, but she wasn't at the head of the table. She was seated to the side. Smaller, Raymond Alden spoke first. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "thank you for coming. We want to acknowledge that what occurred should not have happened." Elias nodded once. A board member, an older woman with silver hair, leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer, we've reviewed your employment record," she said. "Your performance is exemplary. We've also reviewed the disciplinary note placed by operations. It will be removed." Elias felt a quiet release in his chest. Not joy. Relief. The board member continued. "We would also like to offer you a position as safety liaison for facilities and support staff, if you want it. A formal role in which your observations can be communicated without fear." Elias blinked. He hadn't expected that. He looked down at his hands, calloused steady. Captain Harrow had once said the truth needs an engine. Maybe this was one. Elias looked back up. "I'll consider it," he said. Ms. Kessler's eyes flicked toward him, tight with something like disbelief. Alden's gaze moved to Ms. Kessler. "Additionally," he said, "operations leadership is being reviewed." Ms. Kessler stiffened. "Reviewed for what?" Alden's voice stayed calm. "For retaliatory discipline, for discouraging documentation, for creating a culture where staff felt pressured to conceal safety events." The silver-haired board member spoke softly. "Ms. Kessler, we are placing you on administrative leave pending investigation." A hush. Ms. Kessler's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around, searching for allies. Dr. Lyle wasn't there. HR Patton wasn't there. No one was rushing to protect her, because Ms. Kessler had built her power on isolation. And now she was isolated. Elias watched her, and he didn't feel triumph. He felt something quieter. A moral certainty. Consequences weren't cruelty. They were correction. Ms. Kessler stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. "This is absurd," she snapped. "This is because you let a janitor embarrass us." The silver-haired board member's eyes narrowed. "No," she said, "this is because you embarrassed yourself." Ms. Kessler's face twisted, then she turned and walked out. The door closed behind her with a sound that felt final. And in the silence that followed, Elias realized he was breathing easier than he had in months. Pause. A week later, Staff Sergeant Rusk was discharged. Not fully healed, but stable, walking slowly. No dramatic heroics, just the quiet victory of survival. The hospital arranged a small send-off in the lobby. Not a parade. Just a moment. Rusk stood near the entrance. Captain Harrow beside him, Tessa Morgan nearby, a few nurses and staff gathered. Elias stood off to the side, uncomfortable with attention. Rusk spotted him and walked over, careful and slow. He stopped in front of Elias, posture straightening. "Mercer," he said, voice still rough but stronger now. Elias nodded. "Sergeant." Rusk's eyes held his. "You changed how I think about help," he said quietly. "I used to think help came from ranks and roles, but you—" He shook his head slightly. "You were just there and you didn't hesitate." Elias' throat tightened. "I'm glad you're going home." Rusk nodded. Then, in front of everyone, he stepped back and raised his hand again. Another salute. This one slower, more deliberate. Elias hesitated. He wasn't in uniform. But something in him, the buried discipline, the old muscle memory, rose up like it had been waiting. Elias lifted his hand and returned the salute. Clean, correct, respectful. The lobby went quiet. A nurse covered her mouth softly, eyes shining. Tessa Morgan exhaled, like she'd been holding a breath for days. Captain Harrow watched with a small, satisfied nod. And that, finally, was the title made real. They had thought he was a janitor, until he saved a soldier's life. until the soldier saluted him back into himself. And that's when the room changed for the last time. Not into shock, not into anger, but into something warm and steady. Recognition. Pause. CTA. If you want more long-form fictional stories that end like this, where the payoff isn't violence or chaos, but dignity, accountability, and earned respect, tap subscribe right now and check the channel for the next Injustice to Vindication narrative waiting for you. Pause. After Rusk left, Briarline didn't become perfect. Hospitals don't. People don't. But something subtle shifted. Staff filed incident reports more readily. Support employees spoke up without fear quite as often. And in the tenant's hallway, where Elias' name had once been said like an afterthought, people started saying it like it mattered. Elias accepted the safety liaison role, part-time at first. He attended meetings he'd never been invited to before. He listened more than he spoke. But when he did speak, the room listened. Not because he demanded it, because he'd earned it. One afternoon, months later, Elias walked through the lobby pushing his cart. Same mop bucket. Same yellow caution sign. Different air. A new nurse at the desk smiled at him. "Morning, Mr. Mercer." Elias nodded. "Morning." He set down the caution sign near a freshly mopped patch and began to work, steady and quiet. A visitor nearby, watching, leaned toward someone and whispered, "That's the janitor who saved a soldier." Elias heard it. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. Because he wasn't doing the work for the story. He was doing it because service, real service, doesn't depend on who notices. It depends on who needs it. And somewhere deep inside, the part of him that had been hidden, folded away for years, finally felt at peace with being seen. Not as a hero, as a professional, as a man of integrity, as someone who refused to let prejudice decide who deserved to live.